The debris was wrong. That was the first thing Fleet Coordinator Vethenara noticed when the long-range sensors resolved the field around Earth's third orbital shell. Not the composition of the wreckage, not the mass signatures, not the thermal scatter. Those details came later, processed and cataloged by her analysis team in the methodical way the Conclave expected. What stopped Vethenara cold before any of that data arrived was a texture she had no instrument to measure. The debris was arranged asterisk. Not clustered the way wreckage clustered after a battle, not dispersed the way scrap dispersed after an accident. Arranged. The way a word is arranged inside a sentence. The way a door is arranged inside a wall. She didn't report it. She didn't know how. Instead, she pulled the visual feed to her private screen, enlarged it until the rendering pixelated and blurred, and stared at something she couldn't name for 11 full minutes while 47 warships under her command held position at the edge of the human star system, weapons primed, waiting for her order to advance. She never gave that order. What happened next took 3 years for the Conclave to partially understand, and they still argued about the rest. It had begun the way most catastrophes begin, with someone being absolutely certain. High Command Drevoth of the Conclave Strategic Assembly was certain of 3 things when he authorized the Earth Containment Directive. First, humanity was a Class II biological nuisance species, dangerous only in aggregate, easily managed through isolation and controlled attrition. Second, the 47-vessel Periphery Fleet, the largest coordinated military deployment the Conclave had organized in 60 years, was more than sufficient to establish a permanent blockade around the human home system and end what the Assembly's reports called the expansion problem. Third, and most important, humans did not know the fleet was coming. That third certainty was the one that mattered. That was the one that had made him sleep well the night before deployment. That was the one he would spend the rest of his career unable to explain. Because the wreckage in Earth's third orbital shell was composed, analysis would eventually confirm, of destroyed Conclave warships. Ships that, by every record the Assembly possessed, had not yet been built. The human the Conclave eventually identified as the architect of what they came to call the Silence Protocol was not a general. She was not a politician, a weapons designer, or a fleet commander. Her name was Dr. Mara Osai, and her official title at the time of the Earth Containment Directive was Senior Logistics Analyst, Terran Cooperative Defense Network, a department so obscure that its annual budget was smaller than the per-unit maintenance cost of a single Conclave scout vessel. She was 39 years old. She had a habit of drinking coffee that had gone cold because she kept forgetting it existed while she worked. Her daughter had once described her as the kind of person who apologizes to furniture she walks into. She had approximately 2 years before Vethenara's fleet reached the edge of the solar system, looked at a series of unrelated data points, Conclave shipping patterns, rare element purchases, communication blackouts along certain relay corridors, and understood something so enormous that she had sat quietly in her office for a long time afterward, and then said to the empty room, very softly, "Oh, we have maybe 18 months." She did not immediately tell anyone. She needed to be sure. That 18-day verification process, cross-referencing 17 independent datasets across 6 separate human intelligence networks, was the first mystery that would later haunt the Conclave's analysts. Not that she had detected the fleet's preparation. The intelligence breach itself was embarrassing but explainable. What was inexplicable was what she had done next. Nothing visible, no military mobilization, no evacuation orders, no weapons development surge, no frantic diplomatic messaging. From the outside, Earth had continued exactly as before. The Conclave's embedded observers, watching for any sign that humanity had detected the coming fleet, reported nothing unusual. They were watching for the wrong things. The second mystery arrived in the form of a human named Corporal James Tufel, though the conclave wouldn't learn his name for almost a year. He was 26, stationed at a deep space relay post, so remote it didn't have an official designation, only a number, Relay Station 7 Gamma, positioned 40 light-minutes past the edge of the solar system's heliopause. His station's official function was communication amplification for long-range survey drones. It was, by any metric, one of the least strategically significant postings in the Terran Cooperative Defense Network. He had been stationed there for 9 months when the Conclave fleet passed within sensor range during its approach. He filed a routine detection report. His report was received. He received no response. 3 weeks later, when the fleet reached Earth's orbital vicinity and Vethanara began making the sensor readings that disturbed her sleep, Corporal Tufel was still at his post. His atmospheric recycler had been malfunctioning for 11 days. He had been breathing increasingly stale air and had developed a low-grade headache that never fully went away. He was running on rationed food because his resupply had been delayed, which he assumed was administrative error and which was not. He kept filing reports. Every 12 hours, precise, formatted, complete. Sensor data, system status, personal condition, all of it transmitted to a command network that he believed was simply too busy to respond. He was not wrong about the busy part. The Conclave's analysts, when they later reviewed the full record of his transmissions, spent a long time trying to understand why a human would maintain perfect operational discipline at an isolated post with a malfunctioning life system and no contact from command for 3 weeks. They concluded, finally, that they must be missing context, that there must be some external enforcement mechanism, some automatic consequence, some monitoring system that explained the behavior. There wasn't. They were missing the context because the context was internal, but they wouldn't understand that for a while yet. The third mystery was the debris field itself. Vethanara pulled her science lead, a methodical analyst named Keth Saul, into a private briefing room and showed him the orbital imagery. "Tell me what you see," she said. Keth Saul studied the rendering for a long time. Mass signatures consistent with conclave standard hull alloy. Configuration fragments suggest vessel-class design. Reactor traces indicate. He stopped. He ran the calculation again. Indicate periphery-class warships. Our designation. Our design. Current periphery class. The metallurgical signature is consistent with current production. He looked up. These ships don't exist yet. Clearly, Vethanara said, they do. Kethsal returned to the display. After a moment, the arrangement, is it intentional? I believe so. What does it say? Vethanara had been working on that question since the first sensor sweep. She had run the arrangement through 18 pattern recognition models designed for spatial communication encoding. She'd found nothing definitive, and that absence was, she was beginning to understand itself the message. I think, she said slowly, it says, we know what you're bringing and we want you to know that we know. Kethsal was quiet for a moment. That's a warning. Or an invitation. Neither of them moved for a moment. 47 warships waited outside. How did they build ships that don't exist? Kethsal said, and it wasn't quite a question. They didn't. Vethanara had reached that conclusion somewhere around the third hour of staring at sensor data, and it had rearranged everything that came after. These are our ships. These are the ships in our fleet. She let that settle. They're showing us what this field looks like asterisk after asterisk we attack. The silence in that room lasted a long time. Mara Os had not, in fact, built ghost ships or predicted the future. She had done something in some ways more impressive and in some ways more terrifying. She had simply done the math, and then she had acted as if the math was destiny. The Conclave's intelligence analysts would later reconstruct the sequence of events with considerable effort and occasional horror. Here is what Mara Osa had done, beginning approximately 17 months before Vethanara's fleet reached the solar system. She had written a report, 63 pages, classified at the highest tier of Terran cooperative security, addressed to a list of 12 individuals across 6 governmental bodies. The report was titled, with a simplicity that the analysts found somehow more disturbing than any dramatic header would have been, Expected Attack Vector and Proposed Response, Draft for Internal Review. The report contained no recommendations for military escalation, no calls for emergency weapons development, no evacuation plans. Instead, it contained a question, stated plainly at the beginning of Section 1. What does a superior military force most fear from an inferior opponent? And then it spent 62 pages answering that question in specific, operational detail. This was the thing the conclave's analysts kept returning to, kept examining from different angles, kept struggling to metabolize. Mara Osai had not tried to match conclave military power. She hadn't tried to develop a weapon that could destroy a periphery-class warship, or a shield that could protect Earth's orbital infrastructure, or a deterrent that could make the conclave reconsider the mission entirely. She had looked at the math, the cold, unambiguous math that said humanity could not win a direct military confrontation with the fleet being assembled against them, and she had agreed with it completely. And then she had asked a different question. The report was circulated to 11 of the 12 addresses, said a voice in the recorded debrief the conclave would eventually obtain. It was Mara's voice, calm, with the faint roughness of someone who had been speaking for several hours. The 12th died of natural causes before it reached him. I'm told he would have objected to page 47. I think he would have come around. And the response, said the interviewer's voice. Immediate approval, which surprised me honestly. I expected more argument about Section 3. Why Section 3 specifically? A pause, the sound of a cup being set down. Because Section 3 is where I explain that the plan only works if we're willing to lose people, specific people, volunteers, and not in a battle. Another pause, longer. It works, Mara said, if they're willing to stay exactly where they are and do exactly what they were already doing, even after we stop talking to them, even if we can't tell them why. This is the moment where the conclave's reconstruction of events broke down the first time, because the analysts had assumed, correctly, that a plan involving coordinated human behavior across a star system required communication, required orders, required a command structure actively relaying instructions. Mara's plan required none of those things, not after the first month. That was the mid-story revelation that took 3 conclave review committees and 1 extraordinary independent inquiry to fully accept. The humans had stopped communicating their plan to each other before the fleet had even reached the outer system. No signals to intercept, no orders to decode, no command chain to map and sever. Every human in the silence protocol had received their instructions once in full before the communications blackout. And then they had continued executing those instructions alone, in silence, across an 18-month operational window, some of them in conditions that deteriorated significantly, without any external reinforcement, without any contact, without any confirmation that the plan was still functioning. The conclave's strategic doctrine had no framework for this. Every military model they possessed assumed that sustained coordinated behavior required sustained coordination. Cut the communication, you cut the coordination. Cut the coordination, you cut the operational capability. They had watched Earth's communication patterns carefully. They had seen normal traffic. They had seen no unusual military coordination. Their conclusion that humanity had not detected the fleet had been a perfectly logical interpretation of the evidence. The evidence had been engineered to produce exactly that interpretation. We needed you to think we didn't know, Mara said in the recording. Because if you thought we knew, you'd accelerate. If you accelerated, we'd lose the margin we needed. The silence wasn't security protocol. The silence was the weapon. Vethanara spent 6 hours in communication blackout, refusing to advance, refusing to report back to command, refusing to do anything except think, before she called her full senior staff together and told them what she had concluded. "We're already inside the trap," she said, no preamble. Her staff had served with her long enough to know what that tone meant, and none of them interrupted. "The debris is real. It is hull alloy from ships in this fleet. It was placed there to be found, which means the humans allowed us to reach this position before revealing it, and that means they want us here, specifically now." Commander Dresch, her tactical lead, was the one who spoke. He was older than Vethanara by 30 years and had the particular quality of stillness that comes from having survived several situations he should not have survived. "What do they gain from us being here?" "I don't know yet." "Then we should retreat." "And if retreat is what they want?" The silence that followed was a different quality of silence than before. Vethanara watched it move across her staff's faces, that particular recalibration, that moment when a frame shatters and everything inside it shifts. "They are not a spacefaring military power," said Kethsal slowly, as if examining each word before trusting it. "Their fleet assets are minimal. Their orbital infrastructure is what they showed us," Vethanara said. "Everything we know about their military capacity comes from what they have shown us. We have never once observed something they were not willing for us to see." She let that sit. "We assumed that was because they lacked the capability to hide it. I am no longer confident that assumption is correct." The question that nobody said aloud sat in the room like a physical weight. How long have they been watching us watch them? Corporal James Teufel's 12th week alone at Relay Station 7 Gamma was the worst. His atmospheric recycler had failed completely by week 10, and he had been running on the emergency oxygen reserves ever since, stretching them with careful discipline, lower activity periods, scheduled sleep extensions, minimal physical exertion. The headaches had grown constant. His food supply was down to emergency rations. He had developed a slight tremor in his left hand that appeared when he was tired. He filed his reports every 12 hours, precise, formatted, complete. On day 81, something changed. His long-range sensor array picked up a signal on a frequency he hadn't expected to see active. A tight beam transmission, encrypted, directed inward toward the solar system from a position consistent with the Conclave fleet's orbital hold. He logged it. He included the timestamp, the frequency signature, the signal duration, and his best automated decode attempt, which produced nothing coherent. He noted that the transmission pattern was inconsistent with standard Conclave military encryption, which he had studied as part of his station's protocol library. Then he noted something else, something that made him sit very still for a moment before he wrote it. The transmission pattern was inconsistent with Conclave encryption, but it was not inconsistent with a pattern he had seen before, a specific encoding format he had encountered in a document he had been given during his initial briefing for this posting. A briefing document he had not, at the time, understood the relevance of. A document that had contained, buried in its appendices, a decoding key and a sentence that read, "If you receive a signal matching pattern 7 Delta, do not respond. Log it, maintain position. You are seeing what you are supposed to see." Corporal Teufel logged it. He maintained position. He did not respond. He did not know what pattern 7 Delta meant in the broader architecture of the silence protocol. He had been given only his piece. But he had been given the piece he needed, and he trusted that the pieces fit. And so he breathed his careful rationed breaths and filed his precise reports, and waited in his small malfunctioning station 40 light minutes past the edge of the solar system. And he did not wonder too much about whether the plan was working, because wondering too much would not help the plan work. This was the thing Vethanara's analysts would spend the longest trying to explain. Not that Teufel had executed his instructions, but that he had trusted the instructions without being able to verify the trust was warranted. This behavior, this functional extension of commitment beyond the point where external validation was available, appeared in the silence protocol across 37 documented human participants, each isolated, each operating on incomplete information, each continuing with a precision that required no external enforcement because the enforcement was entirely internal. The conclave had a word for following orders under duress. They had a word for executing commands from a position of authority. They had no word in any of their 17 recognized languages for what the humans were doing. This voluntary maintenance of discipline in isolation under deteriorating conditions, grounded not in fear of consequence, but in belief that the discipline mattered. Vethenara made her decision on the 7th hour of holding position. She transmitted a single tight beam message toward Earth, not the hostile demand transmission that the Conclave Strategic Assembly's operations protocol required, not the surrender ultimatum that Drevoth had personally drafted and forwarded to her sealed orders. A single transmission, 8 words in the Conclave's standard interspecies communication encoding. I am looking at the debris field. I understand. The response came 43 minutes later, accounting for the round-trip light delay. It was also 8 words in English, followed by a translation. The translation read, "We know. We've been waiting for you to look." "They were waiting for you specifically," said Commander Dresch, reading the message over her shoulder. "Not for the fleet, for someone who would actually look." Vethenara considered that. How long have they been waiting? The timestamp on the debris placement. Kethsal was at his station, running the analysis with the look of someone who had found a number he wished he could revise. The thermal trace on the wreckage suggests it was positioned approximately 16 months ago, before we left port. They arranged this debris before the fleet was assembled. Before we began assembling it, yes. By our timeline, the assembly order came 14 months ago. The room went very quiet again. They placed wreckage from our ships, Vethenara said, each word deliberate, before our ships existed, in the position they predicted our fleet would reach, with a pattern designed to be recognized only by someone looking for something wrong, not as a warning to make us stop, as a message to whoever had the instinct to look. She paused. How did they know one of us would look? Nobody answered. She hadn't expected them to. She keyed another transmission. How long have you been watching us prepare the fleet? The response, accounting for delay, long enough to know you'd send your best. Long enough to know someone in that fleet would be better than their orders. We built this for that person. We hoped it was someone with authority. Are you? Vethenara looked at the question for a long moment. Then she looked at the debris field, arranged in its careful, terrible grammar. Then she looked at her sealed orders from Drevoth, still unopened in full, still waiting for her execution. She transmitted, "What would have happened to us if I hadn't looked?" The delay, the wait, the response that came finally in its flat translation encoding with none of the inflection she was certain had existed in the original. Nothing we did. You would have attacked. We would have lost. You would have won. And then in approximately 6 years, based on what you would have found in our system after the occupation began, your conclave would have faced something far worse than anything we could have done to your fleet today. We built this to prevent that, not to save ourselves. You were already going to win this battle. We needed to make sure you won it asking questions instead of celebrating answers. The thing the conclave found in the human system, when Vethenara finally authorized a cautious approach, and negotiated the terms of what became the first Conclave-Terran bilateral contact session, was not a weapon. It was not a defensive installation. It was not the hidden fleet capability they had feared finding, not the secret military infrastructure that would have justified the 6-year dread that Mara's message had referenced. It was a room in a building in a city called Nairobi, in a building that had no military designation, staffed by 12 humans who had been working without significant breaks for over a year. The room contained the most comprehensive analysis of conclave strategic psychology, organizational behavior, political structure, and institutional decision-making that had ever been assembled by a non-conclave intelligence. 1,400 files, thousands of hours of observation data, communication analysis, behavioral pattern mapping, not just of the military, of the assembly, of Drevoth's office specifically, of the pressure structures and organizational incentives and political face-saving requirements that had produced the Earth Containment Directive. The humans had not been planning to fight the fleet. They had been planning to make the fleet unnecessary, specifically by understanding the conclave's internal political architecture well enough to offer Drevoth a version of events in which the fleet's restraint could be presented to the assembly as a strategic success rather than a withdrawal. They had built Drevoth a door to walk through that looked, from his side, like a victory. They had built it before they were certain he would use it. They had built it as the backup plan in case the debris field worked, which they had built as the backup plan in case the communication silence strategy generated enough conclave hesitation to create a negotiation window, which they had built as the backup plan in case Mara Osai's original assessment was wrong about the margin. 3 layers of contingency, each one built in parallel, each one requiring its own isolated team, its own operational silence, its own sustained discipline over months of no external confirmation. How many people knew the full plan? Vethanara asked, in what became the first official dialogue between Conclave and Terran representatives. Mara Os answered from across a table in a conference room that smelled, Vethanara noted, like old coffee. I did, and a small team, she paused. Everyone else knew their piece. And if the pieces hadn't fit? Mara considered this. She was smaller than Vethanara had expected, from everything she'd studied of the human. She had the look of someone who hadn't slept enough in a long time, which Vethanara was beginning to understand might simply be a permanent human condition, at least among humans who did the kind of work Mara did. They would have fit, she said. I spent 8 months making sure they would fit before I let anyone else see the plan. You were certain? No, a pause. But certainty was never the goal. The goal was margin. If I built enough margin into every piece, certainty became unnecessary. Vethanara thought about Drevoth, who had been certain of 3 things and had been wrong about all of them. She thought about herself, who had been uncertain of almost everything from the first moment she saw the debris field and had somehow arrived at this room. That's a very human answer, she said. It's the only one I have. What Vethanara reported to the Conclave Strategic Assembly, after 12 days of preliminary dialogue that would eventually form the basis of the first Conclave-Terran Treaty, was not a defeat and not a victory. It was something the Assembly had no existing category for, and which caused a level of institutional discomfort that Drevoth later described, in his private correspondence, as the most unsettling week of my professional life. She reported that humanity had laid a trap for the fleet that required no weapons, no military force, no technological advantage, and no element of surprise. She reported that the trap had been constructed over a period of at least 17 months, executed by a distributed network of isolated individuals operating without coordination, designed not to destroy the fleet, but to create the conditions in which destroying the fleet became unnecessary. She reported that the humans had studied the Conclave's institutional structure with enough precision to build Drevoth a political off-ramp before he had taken the on-ramp, which she characterized as the most efficient form of military action I have ever encountered, because it rendered military action irrelevant. She reported one other thing, which took her several drafts to phrase in a way she was satisfied with. The humans I spoke with do not believe they did anything remarkable. They believe they simply did what the situation required. This is, I think, the most important thing I have observed. They do not have a word for what they did because they do not conceive of it as an unusual category of behavior. Discipline under uncertainty, action without external validation, sustained commitment to a plan that offered no feedback and no confirmation. These are not, for them, exceptional capacities. They are the baseline. They are simply what they do. I do not know how to explain this to the assembly in a way that will be understood, so I will say it plainly. We did not find a civilization that is willing to fight to the death. We found a civilization that is willing to function indefinitely, without acknowledgement, without reward, without certainty of outcome, in conditions that would cause most sapient species to abandon coordination entirely. The fleet was not the threat they prepared for. The threat they prepared for was us not noticing that the fleet was never the point. If we had attacked, we would not have found a military. We would have found 37 people like Corporal Teufel at their stations, filing their reports. We would have found 12 analysts in Nairobi still working. We would have found Mara Osai somewhere with a cold cup of coffee, probably running the numbers on what came next. We would have won. We would have occupied the system. We would have controlled everything except the one thing that actually mattered. And 6 years later, or 10 years, or 20, because they think in those terms, they plan in those terms, they are entirely comfortable operating on timescales that our institutional memory cannot match. We would have discovered that winning is not the same thing as being finished. Corporal James Teufel's resupply arrived on day 94. A repair crew fixed his atmospheric recycler. A medic treated the tremor in his hand, which turned out to be a minor nerve compression that resolved within 2 weeks. He ate his first real meal in 6 weeks and filed his final report from Relay Station 7 Gamma with the same precision as every other report before it. He received for the first time a response from command. It was brief. It said, "Thank you for your service, you held," and then it said, "The plan worked." He read that 3 times. He had not known until that moment that there was a plan. He had assumed there was a plan, because assuming otherwise would have made the months of silence unmanageable. He had trusted the assumption hard enough to sustain him through 94 days of isolation and deteriorating conditions, and not a single word of confirmation. He later said in an interview that reading those 4 words, "the plan worked," was the most significant moment of his life. Not because of pride. He was quick to clarify that part. "I wasn't proud," he said. "I was *relieved*, because until that moment I had no idea if I'd been doing something meaningful or just stubbornly sitting in a broken tin can at the edge of the solar system while everyone else fought and died. I chose to believe it mattered. That's different from knowing." "And if it hadn't mattered," the interviewer asked, "if the plan had failed?" Teufel thought about that for a while. "Then I'd have been a guy who kept filing reports to nobody in a broken life support station for 3 months for no reason." He shrugged. "I mean, I thought that was possible. I made a decision about what I was going to be while I waited to find out." He paused, that's all it was. The Conclave Strategic Assembly dissolved the Earth Containment Directive 9 weeks after Vethanara's preliminary report. Drevoth issued a public statement characterizing the operation's outcome as a successful intelligence-gathering mission, demonstrating the Conclave's commitment to thorough assessment before engagement, which the full assembly understood to be precisely the door that Mara Osai's team had built for him, and which they accepted without public challenge, because the alternative was explaining the debris field. The debris field was quietly recovered and never officially discussed. Its composition, hull alloy from ships that, at the time of the debris field's placement, had not yet been assembled, was eventually classified, which satisfied nobody who had read the analysis and left the question technically open. Mara Osai returned to her office. She drank her cold coffee. She began a new file. The file was titled, with the same plain simplicity as the first report, Expected Development Trajectories and Proposed Response. Conclave Institutional Change, Draft for Internal Review. She had started it 4 months before the fleet arrived. The Conclave's Interspecies Psychology Archive, in the years that followed, would develop a new classification for humanity, not the Class II biological nuisance designation that had motivated the Earth Containment Directive, not the Class I military peer designation that some assembly factions advocated after Vethanara's report, but something that had required the creation of a new category entirely, a category with no precedent in the archive's 400-year history. The designation they settled on translated, approximately, as a civilization for which the rational stopping point is not a functional concept. The archive's explanatory notation was brief. It said only, every sapient civilization the Conclave had encountered across 4 centuries of expansion and contact had a threshold, a point of accumulated loss, accumulated uncertainty, accumulated cognitive pressure, beyond which sustained coordinated function was no longer possible. This threshold varied between species. Some reached it early, some late. Some could be pushed well past what external observers expected before coherence collapsed. But the threshold existed. It was, the archive's founding theorists had argued, a universal constant of sapient organizational behavior, as reliable as any law of physics, because it was grounded in the same biological substrate that produced sapience in the first place, the capacity to recognize futility. Humans did not lack this capacity. That was the crucial distinction, the one the first review committees had struggled most to articulate. Humans could recognize futility. They were cognitively capable of identifying situations as hopeless, of understanding that the rational action was cessation. They simply regarded this recognition as, in some contexts, one available data point among several, as something to weigh, as information that could, under the right internal conditions, be noted and then continued past. This was not irrationality. The archive's final assessment was careful to make this distinction. Irrationality would have been failing to recognize futility. What humans exhibited was the capacity to recognize it and then make a choice about whether it governed their behavior, to treat the rational stopping point as a recommendation rather than a command, and to continue past it not out of ignorance, but out of something the Conclave's 17 languages kept failing to adequately translate. Vethanara, asked to contribute to the archive entry, added a single line. She wrote, "We built our strategic doctrine on the assumption that every opponent had a point beyond which they would stop. We were not wrong. We simply failed to account for a species that reaches that point and continues anyway, and then continues again after that, and considers this entirely unremarkable. Plan accordingly." It was added to the archive without revision. 40 light minutes past the edge of the solar system, Relay Station 7 Gamma turned its sensors outward, the way it always had, watching the dark. Nobody was there. The report still went out every 12 hours, precise, formatted, complete.